Okay, so we are ready for the next session, that is Nostra Aetate in regional context. But first of all, let me introduce myself. I am Massimo Gargiulo, the director of the Cardinal Center for Judaic Studies at the Pontifical Gregorian University, and I'm very happy to be here, not only personally, but also representing the center that I am running. We are so glad to have this special relationship with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, thanks to the Brennimeyer Beram family, and thanks a lot Karma and Yoni, he was around, and Fedra for inviting me, for organizing this conference that is so inspiring. Most of all, thank you for your friendship and for building up the window that we mentioned yesterday night. So thank you so much. And now I'm going to shortly introduce our first speaker. She is Silvana Kandel Lamdan, is currently a Minerva Stiftung postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Cultural History and Theory at the Humboldt University of Berlin, and was previously a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University. She received her doctorate from the Department of Jewish History at the University of Haifa in 2024. She has published several articles, including one in Harvard Theological Review. And she is giving a lecture entitled Messianic Path Between Dialogue and Revolution, Nostra Aetate in Latin America. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Karma. Thank you, all the organizers. It's great to be here. This is a story about the two movements that engaged almost simultaneously in the 1960s and 70s, yet remained largely invisible to each other: Jewish-Christian dialogue and liberation theology. Both emerged responding to the continent's realities and Vatican II. Liberation theology inspired by Gaudium et Spes, and Jewish-Christian dialogue following Nostra Aetate. Both claimed universal theological significance and sought solidarity with marginalized people, yet they almost never met. What makes this striking is that liberation theologians engaged deeply with Jewish sources. They found in ancient Judaism's worldview and its 20th century reaction by recreation by the Jewish thinkers the key to developing a religious alternative to traditional Catholic discourse that had failed to address extreme marginality and poverty. They used Hebrew Bible rather than Old Testament, cited far more frequently than classic Catholic theologians, and drew inspiration from Martin Buber, André Neher, Ernst Bloch, Emmanuel Levinas, among other Jewish thinkers. As Enrique Dussel, one of the founders of liberation theology, wrote in 2012, his work considers various issues from a Semitic categorical framework, namely Hebrew, which shows unusual and highly contemporary radicality. It is an intercultural work that rises against the Hellenocentrism of philosophy and the Eurocentrism of the European intellectual world. So for Dussel and his colleagues, engaging Hebrew sources was an ideological project to decolonize Catholic theology by returning to its Semitic roots. And I wrote a 400-page dissertation about that, which I hope you will be able to read soon as a book. So for now, you'll just have to trust me. But yet this appropriation happened almost entirely without engaging actual Jewish communities or the vibrant dialogue initiatives in their own cities. And this raises several questions. How did this happen? And I will take the following minutes to make from this, the case study of Latin America, an opportunity to reflect more broadly about two concepts. One is dialogue in general, and the second is revolution in general. So the first part is the emergence of Jewish-Christian dialogue in Latin America. Buenos Aires, 1956. 3 religious leaders, Catholic priest Carlos Cuchetti, Rabbi Guillermo Schlesinger, and Pastor Adam Sosa, founded the Confraternidad Judeo-Cristiana, Latin America's first such organization nearly a decade before Nostra Aetate. By the early 1960s, they launched a television program bringing together Christian representatives and rabbis to discuss theology publicly, and later it was taken by Mario Bergoglio and Skorka. And this was dialogue made visible. Vatican II's Nostra Aetate in 1965 transformed the landscape. This is the second stage. By 1967, formal structures multiplied. The Confraternidad received legal status. Rabbi Marshall Mayer, who would become internationally known for his human rights activism during Argentina's military dictatorship, founded the Instituto Superior de Estudios Religiosos, creating an important academic space for Abrahamic encounter. Initially focused on the theology of the Hebrew Bible, these conversations evolved as trust deepened, eventually addressing the role of religion within Argentina's increasingly turbulent political landscape. And this is extremely dangerous times in Latin America and in Argentina. So it's not trivial that people that coming from different backgrounds get together and discuss politics. It could be super dangerous for them, but it was a safe place for all of them to meet in this context. In the same year, the CELAM, the Comisión Episcopal Latinoamericana, the representatives of Latin American Church, opened the Department of Ecumenism to coordinate the implementation of Vatican II's ecumenical messages across the continent, with a specific section of Jewish-Christian dialogue. The first major initiative came in August 1968 with an international Catholic conference, Jewish Catholic conference in Bogotá, Colombia. The Anti-Defamation League took the initiative and invited the CELAM's Department of Ecumenism, and they both brought together representatives from 11 countries from all around the Americas. In his opening address, Rabbi Leon Klenicki, an Argentine North American Reformed rabbi serving as the Anti-Defamation League's interface director, immediately confronted history's weight, insisting that dialogue cannot start from the present, but must return to the beginning, to the Holocaust's open wound. He then addressed Latin American specificity, acknowledges a continent that has not known devastating wars, but that does know the pains of social change that is slowly introducing Latin America into the complex industrial and technological world. These growing pains, he noted, manifest in certain attitudes that sometimes unleash political frustration through attacks on Jewish communities, transforming this minority into a scapegoat for evils it does not wish to repair. Yet, and this is important, Klenicki remained optimistic, describing the shared realities of this rich continent with possibilities for a great future, but equally threatened by a monolithic regression that seriously threatens religious minority. Here, Klenicki performs a delicate balancing act. He claims the Latin American perspective while maintaining his Jewish particularity, speaking as someone who shares the continent identity. We all live here and we must dialogue. His tone views Latin America as navigating the complex process of modernization brought from the north, and these were critically the strongest years of the North American interventionist policies in Latin America, with the program, very controversial program called Alliance of Progress. And so for Kleniki, all this process was ultimately a positive one, requiring only interreligious collaboration to realize the promises of the continent. But this vision stands in stark contrast to liberation theology's portrait of the continent: poverty, marginalization, structural oppression, and systemic injustice demanding revolutionary transformation. And actually, liberation theologians at the time would become one of the loudest voices against these North American policies. Kleniki concluded, addressing the Middle East 1 year after the Six-Day War, expressing concern about Christian incomprehension of Israel's role in Jewish spirituality. From the Catholic side, we have Father Jorge Mejia, he was Emeritus at the Vatican II and one of Latin America's most important scholars of Old Testament, and he responded with equal urgency. At that time of the Bogota conference, he was serving as a secretary of this department of ecumenism, and he would later be appointed secretary of the Holy See's Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews in 1977, and eventually he would become the librarian of the Vatican and a cardinal. Mejia acknowledges Christianity's heavy debt to Judaism through action and omission over many centuries, recognizing that dialogue must reckon with this tremendous historical difficulty. He also affirms the Church needs to study the place of the chosen land and the state of Israel in the vocation of Judaism. The timing is extraordinary. Days after this seminal encounter in August 1968, took place another much bigger event, the CELAM Second Ecumenical Conference, Medellin Conference. It was the same month, the same country, another city, but not so far. This was the conference. This was the conference that was a breeding ground of the future Latin American liberation theology, and was one of the first public appearances of Gustavo Gutiérrez, who will become after one of the founders of liberation theology. So a week of intensive Jewish Catholic dialogue in Bogota followed days after by CELAM's Medellin conference in the same country, yet, as Kleniki would later write with evident bitterness, the Medellin document made no reference to dialogue with the Jewish community. At the third CELAM's meeting in Puebla, Mexico, a decade later, references to anti-Semitism were removed from the final document. But despite the disappointments, important initiatives did take place between Jews and Christians in Latin America. One of them was the ecumenical Passover Seder, a tradition that began in 1973 and runs as a big event until today. And little disclosure, the woman lighting the candles is my grandmother, and the rabbi behind her is my grandfather. They were the promoters of this and many others ecumenical events. As Holocaust survivors, they after losing their whole family and going through every Shoah story that we can imagine, they arrived in Latin America and decided that this is the lesson they should learn from what happened, and they dedicated their whole life to this. And here is also Father Mejia at the end, with my grandfather there also. They were friends. So yeah. So I grew up in these Shabbat dinners full of bishops and yeah. I just knew I just knew that I should behave nicely because these are important people. But jumping to the next part, liberation theology's absence dialogue. This brings us to the puzzle's heart. Neither Gustavo Gutiérrez's Theology of Liberation, published in 1971, nor other major liberation theologians and text cite these dialogue initiatives or even mention Nostra Aetate. This is striking, given that leading liberation theologians spent formative years at European vibrant Catholic universities, studying with de Lubac, Ranner, Metz, Moltmann, and all the big names that were dealing in those times with the renovation of the church and specifically with the dialogue with the Jewish people. And the Latin Americans, they also don't mention Ressourcement, but moreover, as the novel points out, surveying key liberation theology texts from the 1970s to the 1990s, including Gutiérrez's first edition and the very important two-big volume compilation of liberation theology, Mysterium Liberationis, from 1990, reveals no mention even of the word dialogue itself, showing that the question of dialogue with other Christians, religions, or people of no faith was simply absent from liberation theology's conceptual framework at the beginning. But to be fair, the first explanation is historical and sociological. Latin America in the late 1960s was overwhelming Roman Catholic, 95% of the population. For theologians facing urgent questions of poverty, oppression, and structural violence, dialogue with other religions would have seemed an abstract luxury. Second, liberation theologians wanted sharp differentiation from the Catholic hierarchy. Gutiérrez describes the stakes with stark clarity. The Latin American church is sharply divided with regard to the process of liberation, because the church exists within a capitalist society in which one class confronts another. It cannot escape the profound division among its members. The resulting polarization transcends mere political difference. Among Latin American Christians, there are not only different political opinions within a framework of free interplay of ideas. The polarization and extreme seriousness of the situation have even placed some Christians among the oppressed and persecuted, and others among the oppressors and persecutors, some among the tortured and some among the torturers. When Christians find themselves on opposite sides of the torture chambers, when the institutional church is suspected as complicit in state repression, dialogue with other religions can seem a distraction from urgent moral imperatives. And moreover, Jewish Christian dialogue was conducted primarily through official church channels, often led by hierarchy structures, that the same ones that liberation theologians were criticizing. But there is a third question, or the third point to this, is the question of pluralism. The third is the question of pluralism and ecclesiocentrism within liberation theology itself. Brazilian Benedictine liberation theologian Marcelo Barros offers striking self-critique. Even in committed liberating pastoral environments, he detects deeply ecclesiocentric mentality that criticizes curias and clerical hierarchies and genuinely serves oppressed people, yet remains ecclesiocentric because agent's mental and operational world never leaves ecclesiastical concerns. In this framework, the other, culturally and religious other, does not truly exist. In this foundational period, liberation theology prioritized solidarity with the poor over theological engagement with religious difference. And writing in the 1980s, Rabbi Kleniki pointed to this lacuna with frustration. None of these theologians, liberation theologians, has recognized the contribution of Jewish workers in the formation of Latin American trade unions and social justice, he said. And indeed, Jewish presence among left-wing activists was significantly higher than their percentage in Argentine society. Yet, this concrete solidarity remained theologically invisible. This connects to a fundamental tension about pluralism itself. And we have another theologian, Mexican, Porfirio Miranda, who articulated a position reflecting liberation theology's complex relationship with interpretative multiplicity. He rejected the very common idea that to interpret the Bible is a matter of the mind of the interpreters, since the scripture has various meanings and each adopts the one which moves him most or suits him best. For Miranda, this belief serves a conservative function, promulgated by conservatives to preserve the Bible from revealing its own subversive message. His logic is pointed. Without recourse to this belief, how could the West, a civilization of injustice, continue to say that the Bible is its sacred book? Once we have established the possibility of different meanings, each as acceptable as any other, then the scriptures cannot challenge the West. So Miranda's concern carries weight, and critical pluralism can indeed neutralize a prophetic critique, allowing dominant cultures to selectively appropriate sacred texts while evading their most challenging demands. Yet, his position raises difficult questions. Can there be a space for genuine interpretative difference without sliding into relativism, the relativism he fears? Does commitment to the Bible's liberating message necessarily require rejecting all alternative readings? The tension here is not simply between pluralism and singularity, but between forms of reading that preserve the text's critical force and those that dilute it. Can revolutionary thought, which demands urgent commitment to justice, develop epistemological frameworks that distinguish between interpretative pluralism that enriches prophetic witness and relativism that domesticates it? This raises the crucial question about what dialogue means in postcolonial context. Elad Lapidot, in his recent book, The Politics of No Speaking, notes that dialogue today carries clear ethical weight, intimately connected to epistemic difference, knowledge practices resisting unity and totality. Dialogue is assumed to guarantee pluralism. But he asks, does dialogue really safeguard difference, or does its very existence signify what he calls the fundamental overcoming of difference? And he addresses precisely Jewish-Christian dialogue, saying, perhaps dialogue's doctrine is itself non-dialogical in the sense that it's a common notion that unites Jews and Christians above or below all their difference, making Jewish-Christian dialogue another name for Judeo-Christian monologue. So Lapidot takes this to a different direction, but for me it was a trigger to understand perhaps why liberation theologians were largely absent from Christian Jewish dialogue. They saw its representatives not as exemplifying genuine difference, but as heralds of the same voice. Intuition reinforced by the speeches of the 1968 Bogota conference, where Rabbi Kleniki and Father Mejia, despite differences in religious identities, essentially articulated the same Euro-North American narrative. which is beginning with the Holocaust as defining trauma, moving through Christian guilt and Jewish-Christian reconciliation, culminating in affirmation of the State of Israel. From liberation theology's perspective, this shared framework, however well-intentioned, spoke from within colonial modernity rather than challenging it. And we have the third and final part, which is the Levinas paradox, which will illustrate this gap. As noted, liberation theologians engage extensively with Jewish philosophy, inspired by their interpretation of Levinas' philosophy of otherness. A generation of 1970s Latin American intellectuals sought to theorize their continent as religious and political other. Levinas provided the philosophical framework for articulating Latin American alterity. But what happens when they encounter Levinas not as an abstract philosophical figure, but an actual Jewish interlocutor? Actually, Levinas and Enrique Dussel met in 2 times. The first one was in Paris in 1971. So in this meeting, Dussel will tell, while speaking with Levinas in Paris at the beginning of 1971, I could verify the degree of similarity of our thinking with that of the French philosopher, but at the same time, the radical rupture that already then had occurred. He told me how the great political experiences of his generation had been the presence of Stalin and Hitler, to dehumanizing totalization, fruit of European Hegelian modernity. Till now, it's everything okay, but Levinas, he continues, as a Jewish thinker, could find in his existential experience a point of exteriority that enabled him to criticize the totality of European thinking. On the other hand, he had not suffered Europe in its totality, and its holding point was still Europe itself. While we, Latin Americans, Africans, and Asians, the peripheral world, we have suffered Europe, and our holding point is a story of external to the center, positive in itself, although the culture world has considered barbarian and culture. So this passage reveals tensions over whose suffering provides the vantage point for criticizing European modernity. For Dussel, even Levinas' catastrophic personal experience as a persecuted Jew during the Holocaust unfolds within European internal conflicts rather than from the position of Europe's colonized victims. The distinction concerns not the degree of validity of suffering, but its location. Jewish persecution occurs within the West boundaries, while colonization constitutes the West outwards violence. For Dussel, only this later position, as object of Europe's imperial reach, generates the exteriority, which is another term he borrows from Levinas, necessary for fundamental critique, raising difficult questions about competing narratives of oppression. So a complex paradox of philosophical borrowing emerges here, one that resists simple judgment and of appropriation or misuse. Levinas' framework, his concept of the other, critique of totality, ethics of alterity, prove extraordinarily generative for liberation theology's articulation of Latin American otherness, offering conceptual tools that seem unavailable within dominant Western philosophical traditions. On the one hand, in the process of universalizing these concepts, they were necessarily detached from the specific Jewish particularity and historical experience that generated them, the condition of being other within European modernity, and redirected toward what liberation thinkers identified as different periphery, one defined by colonization rather than by minorization. Don't know if that's a word. Liberation theologians conceptualize Latin America as Messianic space, drawing on the Hebrew prophetic tradition and its discourse on marginality and alterity, both categories that in European context had been closely associated with Jewish experience, Hannah Arendt, etc., to articulate the condition of colonized people. There is a paradox in Latin American Catholics claiming the category of otherness through Jewish philosophical frameworks while remaining relatively disengaged from actual Jewish communities and their specific vulnerabilities. So, conclusion. We have this picture. We have institutional frameworks for dialogue built from the 1950s on, the Confraternidad Judeo-Cristiana, ISER, CELAM, Department of Ecumenism. We have leaders like Rabbi Klenicki, Rabbi Marshall Mayer, Father Mejia, creating space for genuine encounter, willing to name difficult topics, the Holocaust, anti-Semitism, the State of Israel, and we have disproportionate participation in left-wing political resistance of Jews, and even Rabbi Mayer risking himself in countless times for human rights causes in Argentina. But we have liberation theology developing its revolutionary framework, drawing deeply on Jewish sources, biblical and philosophical, but within an ecclesiocentric frame focused on the poor and colonized, and able to include the religiously other. The appropriation of Levinas becomes emblematic, using Jewish philosophy to theorize otherness while struggling to engage with specific Jewish suffering. But by the 1990s, however, liberation theologians began to acknowledge this gap. This change was related mostly to the debates surrounding the 500-year anniversary of the conquest of America, forcing new reckonings with indigenous religious and cultural particularity. In 2000, Gutierrez wrote a piece and calling pluralism a determinating question for Christian faith, delicate and complex, new and demanding. In 2003, another important anthology of liberation theology would address this same problem, and sorry, we have one Pedro Casaldáliga is one liberation theologian. He brings the quote that we heard also yesterday from Hans Kung, famous quote: "There will be no peace among the nations if there is no peace among the religions, and there will be no peace among the religions if there is no dialogue between them." But this dialogue, Casaldáliga adds, this dialogue will be useless, even hypocritical and even blasphemous, if it does not turn toward life and toward the poor, toward human rights, which are divine rights as well. So two fundamentally different conceptions of dialogue emerge. Yeah. The first, represented by much official Jewish-Christian dialogue, focuses on mutual understanding between religious communities, healing historical bonds, building respectful relationships, and the second, articulated by liberation theology, insisting that dialogue must be oriented toward the poor and human rights, serving justice rather than simply fostering good relations between religious elites. So this case study reveals more than liberation theology's limited engagement with religious pluralism. For me, it represents also critical challenge to the Western Jewish-Christian dialogue itself. The question of dialogue's purpose becomes central. Is it the goal primarily mutual understanding and amelioration of historical prejudice, or mass dialogue necessarily orient itself toward life, toward the poor, toward human rights? Can these two imperatives be held together, recognizing religious difference as theologically significant while simultaneously interrogating how religious communities position themselves in relation to justice? What emerges is necessary is not a choice between these two conceptions, but their integration. Authentic interreligious dialogue should bring communities together not only to understand differences, but to jointly challenge structures of power and work toward a more just world, a task standing at the heart of religious vocations itself. Such dialogue would recognize both the particular dignity of religious difference and the universal imperative of solidarity with the oppressed, holding these commitments in creative and productive tension.
Okay, thank you so much for bringing us in Latin America and outside Europe and Eurocentrism. And now I'm going to present our next speaker, Yitzhak Moore. He is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Comparative Religion at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a Rothenstein Fellow at the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel School for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the Hebrew University. His research focuses on the relationships between conservative Jews and Catholics in the United States in recent decades and interfaith dialogue they conduct around theological and political issues. Yitzhak is giving a lecture entitled Spiritual Ties Against Secularization, Neoconservative Jewish and Catholic Thinkers in the U.S. in Light of Nostra Aetate.
Good evening. It's a true honor to be here. First, I want to thank Karma Ben Yochanan, the leader of the Christosemitism project, of which I'm privileged to be a research fellow. My thanks also to Fedor Shapiro for our partnership in organizing this event, and to Jonathan Moss, head of the Center for the Study of Christianity, and to our friends and colleagues from the University of Notre Dame and from the Pontifical Gregorian University for the partnership and presence here. I'm especially happy to be in this particular session, dedicated to the regional context. In fact, I believe this might be the most important session of our conference. Why? No, the session. Because the question of context is arguably the most crucial angle for understanding a real-world life of a document like Nostra Aetate. I will dedicate most of my talk to the political and cultural context of the United States from the 90s, and to the conservative struggle against secularization and the culture wars that are very distant from here. I will try to show how reading the declaration in a specific context leads interpreters to a particular understanding of it. But I cannot begin without a few words on the current context in which the Nostra Aetate declaration is understood at this complex and complicated moment in which we find ourselves within the Jewish-Christian dialogue. As Karma just explored yesterday, the old context of Nostra Aetate has shifted. Both communities have wandered from their mid-century centers, creating new divergent realities where the very meaning of dialogue is now contested. Just 3 weeks ago, a conference very similar to this one was held in Rome. Alongside the conference, representatives from various religions were invited to a central ceremony at the Vatican to celebrate 60 years of this declaration. As many of you know, two unfortunate incidents occurred during the week, illustrating how much work remains. One was more intellectual, and I mean to the words of Mario Imperatori, who not only described the satanic nature of the State of Israel, but also drew comparisons between Israel and the Nazi Germany. The second event was on the popular level. After we entered St. Peter's Square for the Pope's audience, a Swiss guard spat at two of our colleagues from the Jewish delegation. The immediate and unequivocal disavowal of these incidents by our hosts at the Pontifical University, led by Massimo Gargiulo, was heartening, and we thank them for their continued support. But it did not erase the impression left. One could, of course, dismiss this incident as mere remnants of an old anti-Judaism, a relic of the pre-consular church, unfortunate but anachronistic. But the feeling among us was different. These incidents were intimately tied to the specific political context of this moment. I'm referring, of course, to the ongoing war in Gaza. The accusation of the satanic nature of Israel and the spitting, an act of visceral, pre-rational contempt, are not political commentary or substantive criticism. They are chilling echo of an old Christian theological charge that views Jews as a group that, failing to transcend to the universal, insists on speaking the language of power. In both cases, the current political reality provided a trigger for prejudices that Nostra Aetate sought to overcome. This reality forces us to pose a difficult question. In light of these events and the diverse interpretations of Nostra Aetate across different regions and times, is there a basic reading of this document that could create a core of agreement? Can the practical relationship derived from this declaration toward Judaism, Jews, and the only state of these Jews, withstands various historical contents, even painful and difficult ones? And I would like to add another open question to carry with us as we move to the American context. We know that Nostra Aetate holds a relatively lower hierarchical status compared to other Vatican II constitutions. So the question is this declaration valid in all cases? Or, when it appears to contradict other church principles or interests, is it liable to be rejected as inferior? With this question in mind, let us now move to the historical context of the 90s in America. My research focuses on a group of Catholic thinkers who forged a strong relationship with Jewish counterparts in the shadow of Nostra Aetate, forming a powerful alliance. To understand this alliance, we must first understand the Catholic moment in America, a term popularized by Father Richard John Newhouse, on the right, a central figure in this movement. This project was developed by a group of thinkers, many of whom began their careers on the political left, but had all moved to the right. They founded the journal First Things, which became one of the most influential religious journals in America and was defined at its inception as a Jewish Catholic enterprise. Michael Novak's personal journey is illustrated in the left. As a young liberal reporter at the council, he wrote the celebrated book, The Open Church, praising its innovative spirit. Decades later, however, he would become a much more critical conservative voice. The core argument was that American democracy was facing a moral crisis because religion had been stripped from public life, leaving a naked public square. This is the name of Neuhaus's book. They argued this vacuum was being filled by a moral relativism. In their view, Catholicism, with its deep intellectual tradition and commitment to natural law, was uniquely positioned to provide a moral foundation that the American experiment in liberty desperately needed. In parallel to this internal Catholic project, the relationship with Judaism was also evolving. The Catholic Church in the US had eagerly embraced the Council's declarations. Concurrently, the concept of the Judeo-Christian tradition was gaining popularity as a tool to frame religion as foundational to American democracy. It was here that these two streams converged. The project to influence the naked public square could not be accomplished by Catholics alone. They needed allies. They found their most natural allies in neoconservative Jewish thinkers. What united them? A common enemy, the secular relativism, and the shared fear that this secularism would erode the moral foundations of the West. This perspective was not merely a matter of political arithmetic. It was deeply held conviction. This stance becomes most intelligible when viewed through the specific historical and social context in which they operated. Here, Nostra Aetate was situated with a broader, ongoing interruptive debate within the Church. As Massimo has shown, the post-consular landscape in North America was marked by evolving forms of reception and opposition. Fagioli identifies the neoconservatives of the 90s as a distinct group that at the time distinguished itself from radical traditionalism. Unlike those who rejected the council outright, this group adopted a strategy of defending what they saw as the true council against liberal interpretations. They championed what Pope Benedict XVI would call a hermeneutic of continuity, or a renewal within tradition. This approach, as Gavin da Costa has analyzed, seeks to distinguish between the unchangeable deposit of faith and its historical expressions, thus allowing for genuine reform without doctrinal rupture. In the view of these neoconservative Catholics, the Council did not create new doctrine, but re-articulated timeless truths. My argument is that they applied this same lens to Nostra Aetate, seeing it not as a simple call for reconciliation, but as a powerful theological license for the Grand Alliance against secularization. This choice of interpretation links directly to the question of context I raised at the beginning. For example, when Richard John Neuhaus resisted the claim that Nostra Aetate was formulated from the political context of the Holocaust, he was asserting his interpretive method. For him, arguing that the Holocaust influenced the way the declaration was stated is a liberal reading that implied a rupture with church tradition. Instead, he insisted that Nostra Aetate must be understood as a profound theological statement, a return to the sources, and not merely a sociological reaction to a historical tragedy. As he put it, the declaration is hardly a public relations fixed under the pressure of post-Holocaust guilt. It is rather a profound reflection on how, as the Church more deeply explores the nature, she discovers the inextricable link with the people of Israel. And yet, the central argument of my talk is that while Neuhaus rejected the political context of the post-Holocaust Europe, precisely because it implied a rupture, he became the most brilliant articulator of Nostra Aetate within a new and highly specific political context of his own, the American culture wars. The spiritual ties mentioned in Nostra Aetate section 4 became a present political reality. Michael Novak, for example, captured this sense of Jewish indispensability. He argued that Christians today must learn and reabsorb a list of essential virtues from living Judaism, writing. This is the list of the virtues. A reverence for the scripture, a sense of the sacred, respect to the law, humility before the transcendent, the cherishing of the human capacity for reflection and choice, the practice of compassion, the ideal of friendship with God and of walking with God, the habit of prayer, and the sense of the presence of God during the activities of every day. For Novak, this deep connection led him to state that to be Christian is, quote, in a very subtle sense to be a Jew. This deep sense of shared purpose was articulated by Neuhaus himself, who reflected on the momentous import of this relationship. How could these thinkers express such profound warmth while remaining strictly orthodox on the ultimate truth claims of Catholicism? This is where the concept of fulfillment becomes central. Nostra Aetate itself does not use the term. However, in the decades following the Council, it became an accepted concept to explain the relationship between the Old Covenant with the Jews and the New Covenant with the Christians. Theologians like Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger championed this concept. Fulfillment proposed that while the Jewish covenant remained valid, it finds its ultimate completion or meaning in Christ. This was the new orthodoxy. It avoided the crude supersessionist claim that the Church replaced Israel, while still affirming the finality and universality of Christ. The neoconservatives seized upon this. It allows them to maintain their full Catholic orthodoxy while simultaneously affirming the permanent divine role of the Jewish people as their elder brothers and allies. This framework allowed Neuhaus to write, with respect to Judaism, Christians today are exhorted to reject every form of supersessionism. The end of supersessionism, however, cannot and must not mean the end of the argument between Christians and Jews. We cannot settle into the comfortable interreligious politics of mutual respect for positions deemed to be equally true. Christ and his church do not supersede Judaism, but they do continue and fulfill the story of which we are both part. This statement is masterclass in their position. He strongly rejects supersessionism, but in the same breath he rejects equally true positions. The relationship is not one of replacement, but a fulfillment, a hierarchy that maintains Catholic particularity. This theological framework proved highly effective. It provided a coherent, orthodox-friendly way to justify the spiritual ties that were the basis for the Judeo-Christian alliance. It was, in short, powerful reading of Nostra Aetate, perfectly suited for the context of the American culture wars. However, this deep sense of alliance and its underlying theology were tested by several public controversies. Events like the 2000 document Dominus Jesus, the debate over Mel Gibson's film The Passion of the Christ, and the discourse around the Gaudo Mortara case suddenly revealed a more continuous tone. Let us look at these three brief examples. First, when a declaration by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Dominus Jesus, reaffirmed that salvation could only be found through Christ, Neuhaus defended it as a necessary clarification against relativism. This stance reflected his broader struggle against what he saw as the capitulation of many American churches to liberalism, sacrificing the core of their truth for a more palatable religious version. He argued, To say that Jesus is Lord is necessarily to say that no one else and nothing else is Lord. This has been and always will be controversial, and is thought outrageously offensive in a culture whose highest truth is tolerance. Second, we see this same logic in the controversy over the Passion of the Christ. As many of you will recall, the film was hugely controversial. Major Jewish organization and even a joint committee of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops raised serious concerns about its potential to fuel anti-Semitism by its graphic portrayal of Jews as responsible for Jesus' death. But the neoconservative Catholics' reaction was one of overwhelming enthusiasm. Niehaus wrote, "It is a gross understatement to say that it is an extraordinary film. It is certainly the best cinematic treatment of the Passion, or indeed of any biblical subject that I have ever seen." When Rabbi David Berger from the Yeshiva University expressed the pain the film caused to the Jewish community, Niehaus' response was revealing. He argued that Christians prefer to witness and enter into the suffering and death of the Lord, not to check out its conformity to its episcopal statement on Jewish-Christian relations. This sentence is the key. When the public expression of Christian faith clashed with the demands of interfaith dialogue, faith won. Finally, the same principle was demonstrated again in the 2018 controversy involving the Journal of Fair Things, which published an article by Father Romano Cesario titled Non Possumus. The article passionately defended the 1858 decision by Pope Pius IX to forcibly remove a 6-year-old Jewish boy, Edgardo Montara, from his family after he had been secretly baptized by a Christian servant. The article sparked an immediate uproar, drawing sharp criticism from both Christians and Jews, who saw it as a shocking defense of a traumatic historical injustice. But the justification offered by Cesario and later by the journal's editor Rusty Reno was telling. They framed the issue not as one of Jewish-Christian relations, but as a matter of absolute commitment to divine law. The Pope's action, they argued, stemmed from piety, not stubbornness, a necessary religious sacrifice where loyalty to God's law, as embodied in the sacrament of baptism, must override all human tendencies, including loyalty to one's own family. How to explain these incidents? Why did the alliance give way to conflict in these cases? The answer, I argue, lies in the context. If the spiritual ties with Jews are understood as serving a larger goal, the fight against secularism, then when those ties are perceived to conflict with the larger goal, a prioritization must occur. I suggest that the Catholic neoconservative position can be explained this way. The Council affirmed a new friendship, but it did not demand theological surrender. Therefore, they saw no contradiction in prioritizing core Catholic truths, even when it caused pain to their Jewish partners, especially when they perceived contemporary Jewish actions as working against the Church's mission. This consistent prioritization across all these controversies demonstrate that the relationship with Judaism, as understood through Nostra Aetate, was consistently placed within the political and social context of the wider mission and was subject to a specific order of priorities. As we approach a conclusion, let us jump ahead now to developments in recent years. If we observe the claims made by some Catholics about the special relationship with Jews, we must ask ourselves in what sense these claims fulfill or relate to the Nostra Aetate declaration. To illustrate this new political context, I would like to quote Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, a prominent convert to Catholicism. However, we must first acknowledge a shift. Vance is not a direct intellectual heir of the neoconservatives I have discussed. Rather, he represents a younger generation of Catholics who are more nationalists in their outlook and perhaps less rooted in the deep intellectual and theological traditions that characterize figures like Niehaus. Shortly before his election, Vance explained some of the principles of his foreign affairs policy. To explain his vote against military aid to Ukraine but in favor of military aid to Israel, he said, "A majority of citizens of this country, America, think that their savior, and I count myself as Christian, was born, died, and resurrected in that narrow little strip of territory of the Mediterranean. The idea that there is ever going to be an American foreign policy that doesn't care a lot about the slice of the world is preposterous because of who Americans are." Notice the leap in his logic. He speaks of the Savior and he speaks of the land, that now little strip of territory, but the Jews themselves seem to be skipped over. He grounds American support not in a relationship with the Jewish people or the spiritual ties of Nostra Aetate, but in a Christian possessive connection to the geography and the sacred history of the Holy Land. Is this a genuine new interpretation of the spirit of Nostra Aetate, or is it rather instrumental use of religious language to advance political goals? I do not have the answer, but this ambiguity brings us back full circle to the question I posed at the beginning. This ambiguity reflects a broader phenomenon on the American right today. We often hear expressions of religious commitment to the connection with Jews or Israel. Yet, the same political camps sometimes struggle to withstand the surge of anti-Semitism that has recently washed over them when political circumstances dictate otherwise. To conclude, the case studies from Rome and the US remind us that Nostra Aetate cannot be read in a vacuum. But they also force us to ask that final, more difficult question: is there any minimal interpretation of this document what we can agree on? In what way can a written text help us transcend a specific historical context and posit a clear moral stance against it? The American neoconservative case study that I just described suggests a complex answer. It shows us that perhaps the enduring power of Nostra Aetate is not that it provides a single transcendent meaning and stands above context. Perhaps its true power lies in the fact that it relentlessly forces us in each new and difficult context to have this conversation anew. Thank you.
So thank you so much, Yitzhak, also for highlighting some critical points, some of which are very, very close to us. And I completely agree with you that there is a lot of work to be done here. Okay, thank you. And now, the last speaker of this session is Bishop Étienne Vetö. He is a Catholic bishop, auxiliary bishop of Reims in France, and reverend bishop for relations with Judaism of the Conference of French Bishops. He is consultor of the Vatican Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews and member of the International Theological Commission. He has taught philosophy in Paris and the Loyola faculties and theology in Rome at the Pontifical Gregorian University, where he was also director of the Cardinal Center for Jewish Studies. I had the impression I had met you before. He has written extensively on Trinitarian theology and on theology of Jewish-Christian relations. His latest book is The Breath of God, an essay on the Holy Spirit in the Trinity, and he's going to give a talk about the shift of gravity of Christian towards the global South, a challenge or an opportunity for a new reception of Nostra Aetate number 4.
So the title of my talk is The Shift of Gravity of Christianity Towards the Global South, a challenge or an opportunity for the renewed reception of Nostra Aetate. And I'm taking a big risk here because I'm not a specialist of this theme. So I'm opening up avenues. I hope there will be more specialists here that can help me put some matter on the skeleton. But I do believe that it's one of the main questions that the Catholic Church will be facing during the 21st century in her relationship with the Jewish people, and thus that the Jewish people will be facing in her relation with the Catholic Church during the 21st century. It's also something that the Council Fathers, however engaged they were in the process, did not and certainly could not see in the 1965 document. It was a blind spot. They could not imagine to what extent the Church would change and develop in 60 years. And the blind spot here is how the gravity shift of the Church towards the South will present challenges and opportunities that Nostra Aetate could not have imagined. It is undeniable that in a generation or two, these are regions of the world where the majority of Christians and Catholics will be found. The capitals of Christianity will no longer be Rome, Constantinople or Moscow or Geneva, but Buenos Aires, Kinshasa, Manila. This is not the first and last major shift that the Catholic Church will be going through, going from a small slip of Semitic land to the wider Middle East Right, exactly. That. And then from the wider Middle East to the West, to Europe and to the West. And now we're in this new process of going to the West, to the global South. It's happened before, it will happen again. It brings along a lot of challenges and it brings along a lot of opportunities. Because of the conferences that we're giving beforehand, I will concentrate mainly on Africa. And one could say concretely that Africa will be the powerhouse of the 21st century. I'm already speaking not only about religious growth, but about demographic growth. You know that the projections are that the global continent of Africa will be growing at a higher level numerically than the rest of the world. And when the rest of the world around 2080 will start declining, Africa will continue to grow. And so by the end of the 21st century, 40% of humans will be Africans. And already in 2025, in 15 years, in 15 years, 500 million Africans will be Catholics. I'm now speaking about Catholics, which means that they will represent a third of the Catholic Church. And this does not only mean a change of numbers, it means a change of way of becoming a Catholic. This I will not have time to expound too much. From time to time I will pull a thread to show how it can have an effect on Jewish-Christian relations. In the time limits I have, I will concentrate first of all on showing 3 difficulties, then trying to answer to these 3 difficulties, and then trying to open up 2 opportunities. The 3 difficulties are the fact that as regards Jewish-Christian relations, this means that Christianity will be thriving in places where Christians will sometimes never have met a Jew, in places where there has not been the living experience of rich and fruitful diasporic Jewish life, which has often intertwined with local culture in countries where Jews lived. So I'm not only speaking of presence of Jews, but how Jews have had an impact on the cultures where they've been living. And in many Central European places, you cannot know whether a food you're eating or a name you're using comes from Jewish heritage or from the local heritage. You can't. You just can't. And that's good. There's also the fact that these are regions which have been far away from where the Shoah took place, and knowing the tremendous impact that the Shoah had on defining Jewish self-understanding, and also in defining Christians' relationship to the Jews. The question will be, I'm going to refer to Nostra Aetate. Nostra Aetate says, the church draws sustenance in a present term from the Holy Root. How will the church draw sustenance in a present tense from the Holy Root if she has no living relations with the Jews? Whether they be the inner theological Jew or the inner rabbinical Jew or the flesh and blood Jew. We've spoken about this before. This is the first difficulty. The second challenge, I think, is the traumatic experience of having been colonized means that the foundation of the modern state of Israel can tend to be read according to the lenses of colonization and strongly rejected, and the plight of the Palestinian people approached with the categories of post-colonialist liberation theology. Was that clear? There's a strange noise, isn't there?
You can give this sentence again because it's
yes. Maybe it's because of what the sentence means that it's trying to be. So I'll try to read the sentence as it is and speak in the microphone. Okay. The traumatic experience of having been colonized means that the foundation of the modern state of Israel can tend to be read according to the lenses of colonization, can be understood as a form of colonization, and the plight of the Palestinian people approached with the categories of post-colonialist liberation theology. And that, I think, is a big problem in some African countries or in some of the countries of the global south. It's probably also a question for many of the younger generation. Okay. The third challenge, this is a bit close to what Karma was saying the first day. The importance of African Christianity in the 21st century will not only be a question of greater numbers, but it will bring with it specific ways of being Christians. David Ngong, who's an African theologian, speaks about a new Christianity, and one of the traits of this new Christianity seems to be an all-pervading sense of spirituality and religion. And Ngong speaks of a, I'm quoting, holistic world where there is no difference between the sacred and the profane. He even evokes a new Christendom, a new Christendom. Historically, the Western separation between state and religion and the development of a secular civil society allowed Jews and different religious groups to be themselves and to enter into dialogue with Christianity, specifically because they had become one of many and equal in dignity, because we were not in Christendom anymore. But now we are being promised a new Christendom. So what will happen with pluralistic dialogue? Those are the challenges. Quickly, in the time frame, a few answers. I think one of the main answers, and that will be for people who know me, they will say, okay, here he goes once again. Because you know that one of my main cheval de bataille, I'm French, you know, I can allow myself a bit of French in my, one of my main, how do you say this? Hobby horses, thank you. Hobby horses, is that even though Nostra Aetate was a 4-page document and only spoke about the relationship with other non-Christian religions, it actually had an impact that makes it much more of a niche document. It has an impact on the way the Catholic Church perceives herself as a whole and perceives her whole theology. Just to give one tiny example, if the Jewish people are permanently in covenant with God, then the Jewish people are the people of God. And when the Catholic Church says during the Second Vatican Council that she is the people of God, we come up with a difficulty. It's a solvable difficulty. It can be interpreted. But it does mean that the whole of Christian theology will need to evolve in the same way as it has in the past when it's encountered the biblical movement or the liturgical movement or the ecumenical movement. It has to understand itself better, and it's actually gained benefit from it. But this is something that is still to do in the 21st century. And I believe that once a Catholic understands to what extent the Jewish people are the core people of what is to become the people of God, or what is the people of God, and as I've said already and struck already some of the participants of this encounter, I believe that if the Jewish people disappear, the church will disappear. It just makes sense. Then this also means that if this is really part of Catholic theology and of Christian theology, at least the inner Jew will be at a very central part of the construction of faith. And we could say the same thing for the rabbinic Jew, in the sense that if we Catholics still believe that Jews are being illuminated on their way towards the end of times by God in their understanding of the scriptures, then we Catholics need to listen to Jews to have a complete understanding of the scriptures. This could even be translated into liturgical ways of beings. You know, there's a saying in Catholic theology which is lex credendi, lex orandi, which means that there is that the law of faith and the law of belief both express each other and inform each other. But for example, I could give a lot of examples, and Christian Rutishauser here could give many more. But for example, why don't Catholics, except maybe in the Latin Patriarchate in Jerusalem, have the feast days and memory days of Abraham and of the patriarchs and the matriarchs and all the just and saints of the Holy Testament of the Hebrew Bible? So this, for me, is one of the answers. Even in places where no Jews concretely live, to have the Jewish people as a core point of the whole structure of theology would help setting them and helping them be understood at their right place. A bit more complicated is the question of reading the establishment of the State of Israel with colonial lenses. I'll do what I can. I'm speaking in my name. I'm not speaking in the name of the whole Catholic Church here, okay? I do think that there is one difficulty that we have every time we approach a historical or a political situation, is that we understand it through other lenses, through lenses given to us by other historical and political situations. I'm sorry, but wokeism, is that how you say it in English? It's not everywhere. It isn't. But you can find, he who finds, he who knocks at the door finds. And it's the same thing for fascism, even though there are true risks. And I believe that in the concrete situation of the establishment of the State of Israel, it's true that there has been some colonial ideology that has been put in the thinking of the State of Israel. But not only. In the middle of the 40s, in Europe, there were sharing of lands and displacements of populations between Germany and the Czechoslovakia and Poland. And I think that the people who were behind these plans had also thought of those, which are not typically colonial movements, but simply exchanges of lands. And then it becomes even more complicated because there are lies. For example, a people without a land for a land without a people. That's a lie. I mean, I'm sorry, I can say that. A people without a land for a land without a people. But can one speak about colonialism when poor refugees of many countries of the world find refuge in the land of their ancestors? I'm going to read a bit slower. While taking the land of someone else's ancestors, when they used armed forces with ambiguous promises of giving back some land and ambiguous plans of using the war to expand, but when they do so out of desperate self-defense. I don't know if, in each part of my sentence, I'm just going back and forth. Just to show how not simplistically colonialistic it is. Can one speak of colonialism when the economy they develop is for themselves and not for a mother country? Can one speak of colonialism when what is a source of humiliation and disaster, nakba, for many, and when no agreement seems to be found, is also a resurrection for many, and close to a unique event in history when a people are able to rebuild a country and a language after 2,000 years of diaspora, even though some will say that their ancestor has been too mixed by diaspora to be considered Jews. That is an accusation given to the Jews who have made Aliyah. Their ancestor is too mixed for them to be Jews. I would put that in the category of another lie. So one can agree or not agree. One can see perhaps more, perhaps less, the shadows and the lights. But I think that the word colonialism does disservice to the Palestinians, to the Israelis, and to all the countries who have gone through strict colonialism in the more exact term. Now, the terrible events happening in the West Bank are much closer to colonialism, I have to say this, but what we should be doing is working out the right word, the right paradigm, which can encompass all the unique and complex reality that proceeds about the establishment of the State of Israel, and be very attentive in many historical events not to easily overimpose pre-existing paradigms on events we become incapable of understanding as they are. Let's try to find a new word. I don't have it. Let's try to find a new word. This is one aspect. However, in my research, I've also found significant differences between countries, and I think it's very important when one says Africa, like when one says Asia or Latin America, that we are actually speaking about different countries. And of course, individual and family experiences. And many have perceived the establishment of the modern State of Israel in continuity with the biblical narrative of the arrival and conquest of Canaan. I was speaking recently with an Ivorian PhD student who would tell me that watching news from Israel was like seeing the Bible become alive again. Some of the first generation theologians of the current black theology have been inspired by Zionism in a quest for cultural roots and land, thinking of Anon. So the attitude towards the State of Israel is a mixed one. A third point is this question of the strongly spiritual society and place of secular and non-secular. Ngong emphasizes how different the Western Christendom and the New African Christendom may be. In the former Christendom model, Christianity, as a dominant religion, set the rules by which everyone else was to live. I'm going to quote, "Such a perspective cannot work in Africa," says David Ndong, "in which three major religions hold sway, namely African traditional religion, Christianity, and Islam. Although Christianity is spreading in Africa, Christians are aware that there are many others in the continent, and even in their same country, who adhere to different religions. He even concludes that it can be a model for the West, who can see in Africa, quote, the possibility of living peacefully in a religiously pluralistic world. Having myself lived in different African countries for long periods of time, this does not seem implausible. There is a question, though, is an unknown factor, radical Islam, which does not correspond to Ngong's analysis, that is perhaps a more recently imported phenomena. The question here is, what influence may this type of radicalization have on other communities and tradition? Who knows? I mean, this is really an unknown. And without considering the strictly political dimension, there's an interesting, perhaps fruitful dimension to take into account, the strongly spiritual and pervading aspect of African religiosity. Much Jewish Christian and interreligious dialogue has been done so far in secular settings. However, there is much sense in thinking that a strongly religious people can connect with what they perceive of a sense of God, of the sacred, of the spiritual in the other, which fosters esteem, curiosity, a form of closeness. This was already what Michael Visegrad used to say when he said that he thought that Orthodox Judaism had better opening to discussing with Orthodox Christianity or with believing Christianity than secular Judaism. I don't know, maybe you could help me on this one, but I think that there has been experiments in monasteries, Buddhist and Hinduist monasteries, who have exchanged members with Catholic monasteries.
Yeah, that's for Catholic.
Yeah. Or you maybe okay. I wasn't there at your talk, so that. Okay, and once again, I shouldn't repeat this, but once again, I think that these questions are very alive. This is not only a global South, global North, or Africa, global North question. It really is a generational question. I think that the same questions are to be posed about the younger generation. Now, so far, and I probably have come to the end of my time. Oh, what I could have done, is add 2 points. Let's see if I can do it. One sentence each. Maybe that's possible. I have 5 more minutes. Wow. Time just seems to... Yes. Maybe without entering into details, there already has been theological research done that could be a point of contact with African theology. That is what in America has been called black theology, and what in French-speaking Africa has been called négritude theology, where we see that the experience of the Exodus has helped Black Americans understand that the essence of God is to be found in his proximity to the poor. And not only to the poor as an individual, but a poor living in a community, and a poor expecting a historical liberation. And that this actually tells us something about God. Now, it could have a risk, which would be that every generation of poor could replace the Jewish people. And here, Henry James Cone is very clear. James Henry Cone is very clear on the fact that the Judaity of Jesus, as he says, or as Boyarin sort of rereads Cone, says, gives a paradigmatic dimension to this first liberation. So nothing can really replace it. It gives the concepts for it, and there's an aspect of the Judaism of the Hebrew people, and in this case, since we're with Christians, of Jesus, that means that no other people can take the place of the Jewish people, because an African can easily find intimacy with an African, but will never find the same kind of intimacy with Jesus as a Jew. And in this case, this opens up the space for the otherness of Jesus as a Jew. So Jesus is both, or the Hebrews in Egypt are both a sort of a paradigm. Others can live the same thing, but then in the end, they still need to have the original version as a Jew. And the second thing is, this is absolutely not scientific, what I'm going to say. It's just, I've lived for 6 years in Africa, and I am very struck by the fact that there's a sort of normalcy or congeniality of many Africans reading the Bible and what they find in the Bible, which means parables, narratives, histories of families, ancestors, proverbs. It's just, it flows easily. And I could even say something that Christian theology has totally lost, and has lost by explaining that it doesn't make sense, but I'm not sure it doesn't make sense, which is purity and impurity laws. Is it so easy just to drop that off? And dietary laws. Those have just been forgotten. They make no sense. I do believe that there is something that could be a point of contact. Let's conclude. I'll conclude in 3 points. First of all, who am I to give this talk? There should have been an African or an African theologian giving this talk. Second thing, Karma, I think, in a talk once said that Israel was Judaism's global south. And maybe there is something very true in this. Catholicism has her global south. Judaism is developing its own global south. Now, I don't know if this means we would need to talk more. I didn't hear this talk of yours. This may mean that Arab Jews or Mitzrayim are more of the representatives of this global south. I don't know if that's one of the directions you were taking. But giving them their place would be part of this. And the third thing I'd like to say is I've been speaking a lot about how these new Christians that will develop in the next 20 years can have esteem, appreciation, respect, and love for Judaism. I also think that the reverse is true. The real question is also, how can Jews who will be faced with these new Christians have esteem, respect, love them, and bless them?
Thank you very much, Étienne, for this inspiring talk, which also opened the perspective on Africa and on the global south. So, we open the floor for your questions. I ask you to be as short as possible. Matthew.
Thank you for all of your papers. Silvana, I had a question for you. In your mapping that you did of the liberation theology, did you consider also perhaps the work of Jewish liberation theology and its critique of Jewish-Christian relations? I thought that might be, an interesting piece, and I wonder if in your work you would come across, for instance, Mark Ellis or Santiago Slavatsky.
Yeah. It happened 2 generations later, but or one, starting from the 80s. But the question is, but they focus more on the Middle East situation. But they have a point, and also the problem, not the problem, but the question for them is as to what extent they speak from within Jewish theological intracommunitarian perspective. Maybe Ellis more than Slavotsky, but there's a double game between and outside, within and outside, and
That's why I wondered about it, because they draw on the Gutierrez and yet also Hebrew Bible and interesting synthesis. Thank you.
Rafael?
Thank you to all the speakers. And the question for Monsieur Vetö, or perhaps an observation, do you think that the experience of Ethiopian Christianity and Ethiopian Judaism could be an important element for Africa? Because there is one experience of ancient Christian and Jewish communities interacting on the African continent.
I like short answers. Good point.
Joao and Claire. Joao, please.
I would have a question because it touched both Monsieur Vetö and I forgot the comment. Okay, I'm Brazilian and I felt a little bit forgotten because the case of Brazil in Latin America, the relationships were dated by 1873, the emperor itself. And also it's a particular case of where we have dealt with colonialism, but also a very big presence of African population, and even the Jewish community that is there, historically, and the Amazonian Jews there, they were originally Moroccan Jews. The question is that it seems that the Brazilian case, it doesn't have a space neither in the Latin American spaces and neither in the other kind of discussions. And in the present situation, it seems that since it's a little bit abandoned in the current political situation, it deals that the communities itself, they have to forge themselves, even the relationship between Jewish community and Catholic in Brazil and with the black community, black theologies and everything, it needs to be forged by itself without the eyes of the central discussions. And I would like to hear something about
I need to go deeper into the Brazilian case for sure. I just can say that it's a question of narrative, who's telling the story. So if you tell the story from the official channels of both Judaism and Christianity, you get a story more similar to what I told. And if you go to these local communities of Jews that are not always included in the counts of Jewish people by the central authorities, you get a different narrative. Yet I can say that at least at the beginning of liberation theology and for many years, I think till today, there is no real dealing with the Jewish local communities, black Jews and the Caribbean communities today. It goes to the States, black Jews in the United States, and so it's not a part not of the Jewish official narrative, and not of both Catholic official and Catholic liberation narratives. Sadly, it should be maybe, but yeah, it's not.
Maybe everything I'll say is wrong because I don't know enough, but I have a feeling that in Brazil you are the whitest of the white and the blackest of the black and the most of the most. And so it does make things difficult to bring these communities together.
Okay.
And also there's an issue of class or economic status, which is quite present also in the conversation. makes it more difficult.
Claire and then Sarah. Claire.
So that's a huge question addressed to all of you, in the sense that I don't have the answer, and that's an open one. So I will phrase the question and then explain how it connected to the three of you to give you time to think. So the issue is what we call in the Catholic theology locus theologicus, plural. So loci theologici could be a solution or is part of the problem, because connecting with what you were saying, I think that part of the theology on Auschwitz or post-Auschwitz is actually anchored in that idea rather than in systematic theology. I think that it played a huge role in liberation theology to be able to think about the situation, and in a way in Palestinian liberation theology today, that idea of locus theologicus is playing a role. So my question would be, in terms of solutions or problems or how we deal with it, do we have to accept that this is fragmented pluralism, and you have many ways, and there are parting ways, and you have a form of hierarchy between those different situational theologies, or are we going to be able to still interrelate with one another? Can we say, as in other parts of the world, can we say that today Gaza is making us reflect again on theology after Auschwitz? Can we think a theology on Gaza, if it's possible, without the paradigm of Auschwitz? That would be, the bigger question of, is it roads that can't be connected, or do we have still some hope that we can still speak with one another in terms of theologies and dialogue, or do we have to just keep silence until this passes, and so that just word can be born again, and so we can start speaking again, but we have to stop speaking for some time.
Thank you. Who wants to start?
I don't know this term enough, so I don't think I can answer.
I'm not sure I really understood. I have a feeling that we can speak about things that make sense for 20 or 25% inside of our general understanding of things, and that we should allow for this period in which none of us has 100% and none of us can really put it all. But if I listen to your 25% and you listen to mine, at some point we will understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've made it very untechnical. Okay? I just took out all the technical parts.
Sorry for not helping you on that.
No, but you were, but you weren't helping them.
Yeah, I wanted to add a part I skipped in my talk about this paradox or this game between local and foreign. What is considered local? Liberation theologians would say we have little time, and so this time we would spend talking or constructing a native or original Latin American identity. And when you ask them what does it mean, it's a very, very complicated mix between Christianity and local traditions. and Judaism will be definitely a foreign presence, although the whole idea is to return to the Semitic roots of Christianity. So there's a whole issue of authentic or locals and outsiders. And in that sense, the question before on Brazil, the black Jews or the local non-white Jews of Brazil and the Caribbeans could claim for a locality that the official Jewish community doesn't have, or so it's hard question.
Okay, we have Sarah, Gavin, Matthew again. Ladies, so please be short.
Yes, sir. Thank you for all your papers. I have actually 3 questions. I will make it short. One for you, Mr. Vetö. So what you presented for the new Christendom, I was hearing this, and I wanted to ask you if they read the literature of the 19th century Christian Catholic theologian, because it sounds precisely like Paul de la Garde of moving on for a new Christendom, and if we could ask them not about the numbers of the African as a continent being such a huge population of Catholics, then asking more if this is then maybe the answer of the colonization with bringing also the institution and the literature in there. One question. And I have one question to you, Yitzhak, if I understand it right. If you asked in the beginning if there is a level of hierarchy in the declarations, or if Nostra Aetate is less important than others, if I heard it right. If yes, I would say no, but
I didn't ask.
No.
I said.
Oh, you said it, okay. But then as a Catholic, I would say definitely no. And but when it comes to the next question, could you, with the last with the last folio with Danish, the citation, with the care he has for this land, is it a care what drifts from Nostra Aetate, or is it not more a care what have the aim of mission? And could you maybe get from me more the context, because I read him as a person, a Catholic, who's against what Nostra Aetate articulated in a new Israel theology.
Étienne and then Yitzhak.
I must admit, I'm not sure I've heard everything. What David Ngong underlines the most, what he thinks is the newest situation, is that it's a Christendom in a situation in which Christianity is a minority. In the sense that there are 3 main religions in Africa, ancient animist, Muslim, and even though Muslim religion is diminishing, it's still the majority religion. And Christianity, which is growing, but still as a minority. So he would put himself in this situation, which isn't really an answer, but that is how he thinks things.
I was just wondering because of the new,
I actually have something about this, a document more than another document, and because at a certain level, all documents of a council, when they're given, according to the status they're given, are equal and fully equal, whether they're 1 page, well, 4 pages as Nostra Aetate or much longer, where they contradict each other because they can, as anything. What happens is that you see if this point of contradiction is the central point of the document, or is it just en passant? And if it's a central point of the document, then the document which bears it has more weight. Am I clear?
Yeah, but yeah.
I just answer. First about the Declaration and Constitutions. I'm not an expert in Catholic doctrine and hierarchy between documents, but as much as I know, please correct me if I'm wrong, the Declaration is less important than the Constitution. So I'm not saying that it's like the question is what's happening if it contradicts. So I'm not the expert to answer this, but I just wanted to mention that it's important to, because we celebrate it here in other places, but it's important to remember that the hierarchy or the importance of this document is not the highest possible in the church. That was one point. About your second question, the speech that I quote from Geneva is called "What a Foreign Policy for the Middle East for the middle class looks like: realism and restraint amid global conflict." And it's held in the Quincy Institute in Washington, which is an isolationist research think tank. And so the context was not religious. The context was foreign policy, public policy. But he chooses to mention this religious reason or religious root of this policy. And first, I think it's very interesting because he's not master to it, and it happens a lot with him. I just gave one example, and the context was not Nostra Aetate. He didn't mention Nostra Aetate, but I think that if a Catholic high-rank politician speak about religious reasons or roots of his policy, it's interesting to think how it relates to official documents. That's the point of my view.
Thank you. Gavin.
My question was to Yitzhak. Thank you very much, all of you. But Yitzhak, there's a resurgence of very traditionalist Catholicism in the United States that is quite explicitly anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic. And I wonder where you're fitting that in on your map, because in a sense, I thought you were sort of implying that Vance is one direction out of the sort of right appropriation of Nostra Aetate. And now we have a group that seems not even to regard it as existing and explicitly disregard it in a lot of their communication. Could you say a bit about that?
Okay, so of course it's a very, very wide topic, but I'll try to answer very short. So as I mentioned, Vance is not a student of this the people that I mentioned before, but I think that we can say that the vast majority, not the majority, but a big part of these traditionalist Catholicism, Catholics that speak loudly, lastly in the United States, some of them are kind of sedevacatists, like anti-Vatican II, in different manners, but just mention a name, Nick Wetness, I don't know if you've heard this name, he had a very podcast with Tucker Carlson, it's made a lot of noise, and is very anti-Semitic, and is against a lot of the Vatican teaching. So let's say one position is to say we are anti-Semitic and we hate Jews, and we also against a lot of what the Vatican said. I think what is interesting with Vance is, there are two reasons that I brought into the conversation. One, because it's very important. Maybe the highest, the most important Catholic in politics, I think, is the United States. But the second reason is because he's a very interesting person, because he's not, he gave a lot of respect to the Vatican. He was invited to the inauguration of the He came, and if it's interesting, if you, I recommended to see interview with Ross Duat. I don't know to say his name. Ross Duat. It's from the New York Times. And Vance tells him that there is kind of a law, church law, I don't know exactly, that you have to kiss the hand of the Pope when you meet him or something. And he said that he didn't know what to do because it's against the protocol of the American politicians, like the president, vice president, they don't kiss anyone. So he didn't want to know what to do, but then he decided that because he's there, not as a private Catholic person, but as the vice president of the United States, he didn't do it. So I think if anything, he gave a lot of respect to the Vatican, to the hierarchy, to the church, to the official church, but he's still, let's say, flirting with this more traditionalist.
Karma, do we have time for 2 more questions? People who had already asked
I think we need to close, and maybe questions can be asked privately.
Okay.
But I have one announcement to make.
Okay. Thank you very much to the 3 of you.
Sorry.